Hi there, I'm Brandon Martinez. I'm a sociologist and research associate at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. Today, I'm going to be presenting some of my work on racialized generational homeownership inequality. Now, that's a little bit of a mouthful, so I'll start by breaking down what I mean when I say racialized generational homeownership. After that, I'll jump into my research findings, and then I'll wrap up with a short discussion about the importance of those findings. Okay, so there are two main parts of this type of research. First, we have to talk about racialized homeownership inequality. Then we need to understand generational homeownership inequality. Once we have those two down, we can jump into the full topic at hand. So let's start with racialized homeownership inequality. According to the Urban Institute, there's a 30% homeownership gap between white and black households. Or in other words, white households have a homeownership rate that is 30 percentage points higher than black households. Why might that be? Well, there's a bunch of research on the history of housing and homeownership in the US that tells us why there's such a large difference. One of the reasons is redlining. This is a discriminatory practice used by professionals to deny loans to people who live in specific neighborhoods. You can think of this like drawing a red line around a neighborhood and deeming it of no good investment for banks and insurance agencies. The process is actually used to deny loans to Black and brown neighborhoods. And the map shown here of Brooklyn is one of the ways that was done. Another reason for the homeownership gap is renewal or urban renewal processes. While there are tons of projects that we could look at today and identify them as urban renewal projects, the most well-known is arguably the construction of highways through poor, Black, and brown neighborhoods in cities across the US. Not only did this process likely affect homeownership rates in the decades to come, it also disrupted and fractured major communities. One final way to understand racialized homeownership inequality is related to the way that housing is financed. Following the foreclosure crisis, research showed that predatory loans were offered to the same communities that were once denied those loans. There's a lot more to say about how the financial aspect of housing and homeownership contributes to racialized homeownership inequality. If you're interested in these topics, I recommend a few books, which I've listed here at the bottom of the slide. While this wasn't an exhaustive list of explanations for understanding homeownership inequality, it hopefully illustrates to you how there are many contributors to racialized housing inequality. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about racialized homeownership and housing inequality, let's talk about generational inequality. A common argument in favor of homeownership is that an owned home is a wealth-generating asset that can be inherited across generations. As such, future generations would be better positioned in terms of wealth. In other words, a parent who owns their home can pass it down to children and later in life. Homes can also be refinanced to support children's futures. Homes and the land that they sit on can also increase in value as time goes on. Let's see how those patterns of housing wealth might play out by comparing a renter-occupied home and a homeowner-occupied home. On the top, we see a renter-occupied home. On the bottom, we see a homeowner-occupied home. The homeowner has some housing wealth, represented by the dollar bills, but the renter does not. As time passes, the renter thus does not gain any housing wealth. However, as the value of the owner-occupied home increases, so does housing wealth for the homeowner. And in turn, the housing wealth gap between these two households has increased over time. We can see how this plays out in the racial housing wealth gap. This figure uses data from the Survey of Consumer Finances to plot the median housing wealth of white, Black, and Latinx households between 1989 and 2019. The black line, representing white households, is highest in 1989 and remains the highest of the three groups over time. If we focus our attention on both ends of the figure, we also notice that the gap between these three groups has actually increased since 1989. Okay, so now we know a little bit about racialized housing inequality and we know a little bit about generational housing inequality. How can we better understand the interaction of these two issues? Well, we can look within racial ethnic groups to understand generational differences, and we can also look across racial ethnic groups to understand how generations compare. One way to do this is to examine first generation and second generation adults. Doing so gives us a very clear line between generations. So, what would this look like? Well, we'll get into that in just a second, but first we need to have some basic understanding of the groups we're going to be looking at. Here are a few examples. Approximately 5% of white non-Latinx houses are headed by immigrants, or the first generation. The graph on the left side of the screen shows the percentage of first and second generation and people born in the US, or the third generation and more, using data from the current population survey, a representative survey of the US population. You can see here that the first generation, or immigrants, accounts for about 5% of white households. The second generation is about 4%. And finally, the darkest color in the figure, which includes people born in the US, account for 90% of white non-Latinx households. Let's look at some other groups before we really jump into my research. Among Black households, a little more than 12% are headed by immigrants and less than 3% are headed by the second generation. Once again, the largest group includes people born in the US and accounts for 84%. However, if we jump over to South Asian households, we see that the pattern is reversed. 70% of South Asian households are headed by immigrants, and 17% are headed by the second generation, or the children of immigrants. A minority of South Asian households, about 13%, are US born. We see a similar pattern among Cuban households. 62% are immigrants, about 30% are of the second generation, and a little more than 7% are US born. So we can use these racial generational breakdowns to further understand housing inequality. So today we're going to talk about two pieces of my research. The first is my research on racialized generational homeownership inequality. When I conducted this research, I was essentially interested in understanding how homeownership varied across generational and racial ethnic groups. I also wanted to understand what characteristics were associated with homeownership, and also how those characteristics might explain any homeownership gaps I might encounter. And the second part of my research is something I call the housing attainment model. In this case, I wanted to create a model that took our previous hypothetical relationship between parents' housing and children's housing, using the case of immigrants and their children to directly observe the relationship. We'll wrap up today with a short discussion about the findings and their implications. All right, let's talk a little bit about the data and the methods I used to answer that first question. I used pooled data from the current population survey. The data is from a representative sample of adults in the US, and so it gives us a pretty good picture of homeownership in the US. The data were pulled across 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, so that the analysis would include enough people from each one of the groups that I looked at. Specifically, I conducted a cross-sectional study examining homeownership rates for about 57,000 households headed by either immigrants or the second generation, or US-born children of immigrants. Now, because this is a cross-sectional, I'm not looking at immigrants and their children specifically. Instead, I'm looking at people who are immigrants today and people whose parents are immigrants today. While there might be some overlap, it's not very possible to know using the data that I use. However, the data do include a lot of information about head of households. For example, the data identified age, gender, the size of families, household incomes, educational attainment. I also used some of these variables to create community or neighborhood characteristics at the census tract level. This would include average value of homes and the average income in a particular area. So, what did I find? Well, first, I looked at home ownership rates and found a lot of variability between the first and second generation adults. The figure shows homeownership rates for the first and second generation of 16 different racial ethnic groups. The dark blue bars represent the first generation, or immigrants, and the light blue bars represent the second generation, or children of immigrants. On the left side of the figure are white non-Latinx households. We can see that more than 50% of the immigrants in this group own their home. The second generation has a higher home ownership rate at nearly 70%. We can do this comparison for each one of the 16 groups. However, it might be useful to just look at the difference between immigrant and the second generation for each one of the groups. Here, I've subtracted the second generation homeownership rate from the first generation homeownership rate. As we saw in the previous figure, on the left-hand side of the figure, the second generation has a higher homeownership rate compared to the first generation. The figure represents here that difference as a positive value, so the second generation, higher value. Three things are pretty clear from this figure. First, generational differences vary across racial ethnic groups. Whereas the Black non-Latinx gap is about 2%, the Puerto Rican gap is closer to 6.5%. Second, for most groups, the second generation has a higher rate of homeownership than the first generation. And that difference is usually pretty small. It looks like an average of about 5% across those groups. The third pattern is the opposite, though. Very few first-generation groups have higher homeownership rates than the second generation. Those groups include Southeast Asian and multiracial head of households. All right, so now we know that there are differences both within and across generations and racial ethnic groups. And a lot of previous research done on homeownership inequality shows that characteristics like age, gender, income, and neighborhood socioeconomic status are associated with those rates. So I ran a logistic regression model predicting homeownership, controlling for some of those factors. I then used the results of that regression to plot the predicted homeownership rate after controlling for all of those characteristics. And here's what I found. The purple circles denote the predicted homeownership rate for second generation adults after controlling for other variables. The orange triangles denote immigrants' homeownership rates. Like before, we can see the racial ethnic groups are organized from left to right, starting with white non-Latinx households on the left-hand side. The vertical lines intersecting each marker represent the 95% confidence interval for that predicted homeownership rate. For example, if we look to the purple marker in the middle of the screen for the second generation other Asian group, we can see that the model is 95% certain that their adjusted homeownership rate falls between about 40 and 20%. If we look at each group, the confidence interval for the second generation and the first generation overlaps. That means that there are no significant differences between generations. In this figure, only 4 groups show significant generational gaps: white non-Latinx, Southeast Asian, other Asian, and Mexican. So given these findings, I was interested in what explained some of these generational differences. Was it age? Was it income? Was it neighborhood? To figure that out, I looked at the difference between the second generation and the first generation, or immigrant homeownership rate, and ran a pooled decomposition analysis. This type of analysis helps me look at the gap, like the one shown here on the screen, and split it up by the amount that each group of variables explains that gap. So the first group of variables are demographic. This includes age, gender, marital status, number of children, and number of family members. The second group of socioeconomic variables includes income, education, and employment. Then, geographic variables refer to those which I created. This includes the percent immigrant and second generation in a particular census tract, as well as the percentage of same racial ethnic groups and homeowners in those census tracts. Finally, the decomposition analysis controls for differences across survey years. Anything that remains is labeled as unexplained, and we'll talk about what that means in the case of homeownership inequality. So the decomposition analysis will show us the extent to which each one of these groups of variables helps explain generational differences. So here's what I find. Again, the racial ethnic groups are labeled across the x-axis at the bottom, starting with white non-Latinx on the left-hand side. We can see a few things across the groups. First, the blue bar, which refers to demographic characteristics, explains most of the difference between the first and second generation within each racial ethnic group. Second, the extent to which demographics explain generational gaps varies quite a bit across groups. For example, demographics matter little for white non-Latinx households, whereas they explain more than half of the generational difference for Southeast Asians. Remember, this includes age, gender, marital status, number of children, and the number of family members. Next, we see socioeconomic characteristics matter, but much less than demographics. Finally, we can see that a pretty substantial part of the gap is unexplained. So, what's this all mean? Well, first, generational inequality in homeownership seems to be mostly explained by differences in demographics. That makes sense if you think about it. The older you are, the more likely you are to have owned your home because you've had more time to purchase it. It also makes sense given that the immigrants in the sample tend to be older than the second generation. That isn't true of all groups, though, and those racial ethnic group differences might account for some of the differences we see in significance of demographic characteristics. The second insight we can pull from these findings is that differences in socioeconomics play a role in homeownership inequality, but they alone would not close generational gaps. Finally, a substantial amount of generational differences remain unexplained by these variables. Here's where we could draw on the literature on immigrants in the second generation to provide some theoretical explanations. For example, the second generation might have a better understanding of the housing market, which allows them to buy a home much easier than the first generation. However, that doesn't necessarily address issues of racialized homeownership inequality. For that, we'll need to change the model just a bit. In a series of alternative decompositions, I compared white non-Latinx households to other non-white groups, similar to the way that I just did with generational groups. In this case, generational differences would be part of the demographic variables. The findings were a little surprising, as here I found most of the differences were left unexplained by the variables. Why might that be? Because much of what we know about racialized homeownership inequality is not that demographics and socioeconomics shape housing outcomes, but rather discriminatory, exclusionary, and racist laws, policies, and market norms ensure that homeownership is not available to everyone. Part of the unexplained portion here could include real estate techniques that make it harder for non-white groups to buy homes, or conversely, make it easier for white home buyers to secure home ownership. So where does this leave us? Well, first, we saw that there's generational and home ownership inequality within and across racial ethnic groups. Next, the decomposition showed us that demographics play an important role in understanding generational differences. However, demographics and other characteristics don't seem to explain racial ethnic inequality. Those are important findings and underscore the need to address homeownership inequality through a critical racial lens. They leave one major question unasked, though. How do the patterns translate to wealth inequality? For that, we're going to have to turn to the housing attainment model. Earlier, I described this process, whereby a parent's home can be passed down along generations. In simple terms, that's what the housing attainment model seeks to explore and understand. How does the parent's housing status shape their own children's housing status? To answer this question, I use data from a data set called the Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Study, or CILS. CILS was a longitudinal study conducted in 1992. It focused on second-generation children in San Diego and the metropolitan area of Miami. Over 3 waves of data collection, CILS collected information about the youth, including their attitudes and beliefs, as well as their life outcomes. The data also included information about the children's parents. I used 2 waves of data, the first and the last, to connect parents' housing status to that of their children. In total, I looked at about 1,900 second generation young adults. Using this type of data allowed me to answer one of those key questions from the first study. Does a parent's housing status affect the housing status of their children? The SILS data include the necessary data to run longitudinal analysis. Now, this sample won't be comparable to the sample we saw in the first analysis, primarily because it focuses on 2 metro areas only, and specifically on the second generation. For that reason, some of the results we see here might reflect patterns specific to those geographies or those groups. Because we're also looking at observations in the data that have complete information in waves 1 and 3, much of the original sample is not included in the analysis. Nevertheless, the findings will be instructive to understanding how housing inequality and wealth inequality are linked. The first thing I found was that immigrant parent homeownership rates did not substantially vary by race ethnicity. This is in contrast to our previous findings and may be related to the unique sample characteristics of the SILS data. I then looked at the rate at which the second generation lived in their own home by young adulthood, around the age of 24. For young adults, living in your own home may be an important step towards homeownership. I found, though, that this isn't very common for most racial ethnic groups, and that those rates didn't really seem to be related to parental homeownership rates. You can see that here in the difference between the light blue bars and the dark blue bars. For example, even though white and black parents had similar homeownership rates, their children were less similar. Finally, I looked at the second generation homeownership rate among those who actually did live alone in their own homes. I found that homeownership is pretty rare, and again, didn't seem to be correlated with parental homeownership rates. To better understand these relationships, I conducted a regression analysis whereby parental housing status predicted second generation housing status. Just as with the first analysis, I controlled for differences in demographic, socioeconomic, and geographic characteristics. I also adjusted the regressions models to account for selectivity out of the data between the first and second and the third wave. Here, I've plotted the predicted likelihood of the second generation living in their own home by race ethnicity. The purple circles represent young adults whose parents own their home, whereas the blue triangles correspond to young adults whose parents rented their homes. In all but one case, the confidence intervals overlap, indicating that parental housing status did not shape the housing status of their children. I was surprised, however, to see that among the other group, living in your own home was positively associated with parents renting their own home. In other words, a second generation young adult was more likely to have established their own home if they grew up living in a rented home. Why might that be? It's difficult to say exactly, but it might be related to the way the data were collected, specifically in terms of categorizing racial ethnic groups. Among those that did establish their own home, I wanted to know whether they owned their home. I found no differences in home ownership rates based on parental status. Again, I was surprised. One explanation is that the second generation in the sample are too young to have started buying their own homes. They might be saving money in school or helping family. After all, my first analysis showed that demographics to be a key factor in shaping home ownership rates. Nevertheless, I went back and reviewed my understanding of homeownership and its relationship to the wealth building process. Okay, so we saw this relationship earlier. Housing wealth builds over time, but maybe the relationship isn't exactly direct like this. Some research shows that children of homeownerships are likely to achieve higher rates of educational attainment. Those patterns in turn affect patterns of income, likely through the differences in employment associated with said education. Finally, it's possible that those impacts eventually shape housing statuses in the second generation. If this holds true, then we'd need to revise the simple model connecting the housing status of the first and second generation. Instead, first generation homeownership might affect second generation education, then income, then housing. To test this, I ran a structural equation model between these variables, looking at the effects between housing status directly and the effects through educational attainment and income. Here are those results of that analysis. The numbers you see are the direct effects of one variable on another. On the left, second-generation young adults had higher rates of educational attainment if their parents were homeowners. Next, in the middle, we see that they also had higher income if they had higher educational attainment. And on the right, we see that higher income is also associated with young adults living in their own home. Interestingly, the model also showed a surprising direct effect of homeownership on establishing a home. You can see that at the bottom of the figure. In other words, second-generation young adults were less likely to live in their own home if their parents were homeowners. While this might be confusing, it's possible that the second generation in this data still are too young to be moving out, as they might be in college or saving for a home. As such, these findings provide support for two ideas. First, that the relationship between housing status and wealth occurs through indirect mechanisms of socioeconomic status. And second, that establishing a home and becoming a homeowner is a major life course event that's shaped by demographic characteristics. Okay, so we've reviewed a lot of findings from my analysis, and it's time to wrap things up. Today, we saw that immigrants were less likely to become homeowners compared to the second generation adults. That was true for most groups, but not all. And those differences were, for the most part, explained away in the regression models. Importantly, though, white non-Latinx households maintain the generational differences, which will likely result in higher homeownership rates and thus housing wealth for the third generation. The decomposition models showed that generational differences within groups were related to demographic characteristics, things like age, gender, marital status, and family composition. However, the results across racial ethnic groups showed us that homeownership inequalities remained unexplained after controlling for differences in demographic, socioeconomic, and geographic characteristics. In the second analysis, we saw that first-generation housing status was shaped by second-generation socioeconomic characteristics, including income and education. This led us to rethink the relationship between homeownership and the racial wealth gap, specifically by turning our attention to the life course approach to understanding housing and homeownership and attainment. Finally, I hope that these results encourage other researchers to take a critical approach to understanding racialized housing inequality through innovative methods and theoretical foundations. Thank you again for tuning in. I'm Brandon Martinez, and I hope you found this interesting and educational. And thank you to the CUNY Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality for inviting me today.